Federal employees are reporting significantly diminished engagement in their jobs and declining views of political leadership. New survey results from the Partnership for Public Service show major drops in satisfaction and morale during 2025. That's after a year of upheavals across the federal workforce. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
The partnership ran its own survey this year. Why did they choose to take that course?
So this comes after the Office of Personnel Management around mid-2025 decided to cancel the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, or FEVS for short. That's the first time that OPM chose not to run that government-wide survey since it began more than 20 years ago. So that was a pretty significant decision. And from there, the partnership said that they were concerned about what would have been a major gap in workforce data, especially considering how many significant changes there were for federal employees throughout 2025. And they felt that having some sort of assessment, even if it wasn't going to be at the same scale that FEVS can be at least having some survey would be important to keep that data continuing on. So, the results cannot be compared directly, but I think there are still very significant trends here. Max Stier, who's the president and CEO of the partnership, said that the results are largely consistent with many of the other research projects that the partnership has conducted recently and what they've been finding about federal employees. He spoke a little bit about that recently.
Federal employees have suffered a layer cake of trauma. The ultimate impact has been crushing on their morale, as these numbers suggest. This is consistent with all of the anecdotal information that we've gotten. We talked to thousands of employees through our various programming, and the messaging has been consistently that they are fearful, that they are being mistreated. Again, you have a leadership group that wanted to traumatize them, and they in fact did so.
Well, that would lead right into the partnership's overall findings on engagement. What do their survey results show us?
The overall engagement score from employees was 32 out of 100. That was after also that finding that nearly 60% of the survey respondents said that engagement with work has decreased since 2024. This was conducted in November and December of 2025. So for context, it's just as employees are coming out of a government-wide shutdown, or a very large government shutdown, combined with the other changes that took place throughout the year. In total, the partnership had about 11,000 or so respondents to the survey, and that was across 17 large agencies and 13 mid-size agencies. If you compare that to FEVS, they get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of responses, so it's a much smaller scale. But Stier said, even so, the results are a major warning signal.
The top line is deeply distressing. We have every red light blinking across the entire federal government. Morale is as low as imaginable, but it's a deeply distressing story. This is true across the entire federal government. There is no corner that has emerged unscathed.
Drew, I'm sure that you've dug through all of the details of this report. Are there any agencies that stood out to you in their results?
There were a lot of agencies that were lower than that. The government-wide average, again, which was 32 out of 100 on their employee engagement index. Some agencies were much lower than that. The State Department was at 20 out of 100. Department of Health and Human Services, which was the number 2 best place to work in government back in 2024, they scored just over 20 points out of 100 on employee engagement. Social Security Administration had the lowest score of any large agency, just 15 out of 100 on that index. And then NASA, which is long been considered the best place to work in the federal government, their employee engagement score was at 46 out of 100, so less than half on their engagement index there. So, the findings, although NASA technically was on the higher end of the scale for large agencies there were others like the Education Department and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, both of which were heavily targeted by the Trump administration, they had some of the lowest engagement scores of any agency. And I think it's also notable to point out that no agency saw an increasing engagement score.
One of the other comments that is called out in this report is survey respondents' perceptions of political leadership. What did you see there?
Those were also very low of the respondents who took this survey. Just about 7.5% of federal employees who filled out the survey said that they agreed with the statement that political leaders generate high levels of motivation in the workforce. So there's clearly this very negative perception right now of political leadership. At some agencies, it's much lower than other. Notably, at HHS, RFK Jr. is, very much perceived more negatively, I should say, than some other agency leadership. And then more broadly, there's impacts as well. For example, less than a quarter of respondents said that they felt confident that they could report if they suspected there was a violation of a law, a rule, or a regulation without experiencing retribution. So there's this sort of chilling effect, so to speak, on federal employees who feel that they're able to speak up and flag things to leadership as well.
So 2 questions then. What's the plan for this current year's data? Do we think that anyone from OPM on down in the federal government is going to take it on? And what's the plan for next year? Will FEVS be back?
For 2026, this year with FEVS, the plan is to return it at some point later in the year. When I spoke to OPM, they haven't given a specific timeline for when that would be, but we are expecting to see that come back with some changes. For example, they talked about removing questions that were previously on there about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but they're also going to be adding, I believe, some questions about poor performance in government, which has been a high interest of the Trump administration. So I think we'll see that later this year. As for the partnerships results, they've essentially implied that, this was an attempt to fill in what would have otherwise been just a complete gap in the data. So it's assumed or expected that if OPM does bring back their survey, that the partnership would no longer have a need to conduct theirs. So we'll see how this all plays out. If there's another gap, then we may see another partnership survey.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.